Reviewing the quarterback landscape after NFL Week 14. We have 14 weeks of games, Shawn. We are into the fantasy football playoffs, but the landscape is vastly different than it was in the preseason, than it was in Week 1, and it is happening fast and furiously, unfortunately. But we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about one of the RotoViz Overtime community that has come up big in the Underdog tournament in the race for the $1 million. We'll be talking about that in the later part of the show. Really excited to dive into that. We'll be talking about more of the success of our listeners in the listener league, Shawn, as we move forward here. But the key point, I guess, to start today's show off, and this was something that was in our mind before the show started, earlier this week before Monday Night Football, but unfortunately Monday Night Football continues to bring that to the forefront, and that is the quarterback landscape. And for people who watch Monday Night Football, they'll know that the New England Patriots won it. But this was a game where, coming into it, you're hoping, if you're on that Monday Night Football, to get that big score from Kyler Murray, for example, to get that big day from DeAndre Hopkins to push those teams over the line. The big day kind of came from James Conner in this one. Unfortunately, Shawn, though, the part that we have to touch on is Kyler Murray gets injured right at the start of this game. Rushing non-contact injury, goes down. At the time of recording, it's uncertain as to the extent of it, but it does seem like it's going to be a long-term recovery for him from this one. Always concerning when a player goes down without being contacted. Usually I would go through the rest of how the game went, but we'll talk about that after we talk about the overall landscape of both the Cardinals quarterback situation, with Colt McCoy now likely to be the starter, and, as we've seen throughout the season, the kind of carousel of quarterbacks due to injuries, benchings, coaching changes, coaching decisions. What are you thinking as we sit here in Week 14 for both Week 15, 16, 17, and also for looking ahead to 2023?
It's been rough, right? And you have that game last night to finish out the fantasy regular season, and just such a bummer, right? It was basically 2022 in a nutshell. Week 14 had a variety of issues, unfortunately. Week 13, I think one of the most fun weeks of the season. Definitely good for us. I think good for the listeners. Week 14, much more all over the place. I was fortunate enough to have some big scores when I needed them. And at the same time, you have a lot of bad things happen as well. I was hoping that this would be the perfect game to finish out the season, right? Where you have Kyler Murray puts up a huge number of points now that he has DeAndre Hopkins and Marquise Brown healthy. You have Ramondre Stevenson, who really, I think, is in a very, very small group of players who could be considered the fantasy MVP. Obviously, Josh Jacobs, probably the leader, but Stevenson, Pollard, a couple other names pushing there. And you just want this to be a night of scoreboard watching. I mean, we after this game, we all go through and see, how many Best Ball Mania teams do we have advanced? How many FFPC Best Ball Tournament teams did we have advanced? Did our main event team win the FFPC League Finals? Did I get into my Home Dynasty League? Did I get into my RotoViz Triflex Dynasty League playoffs? All of these different things, many, many more permutations beyond what I just mentioned. To have so much of that short-circuited at the beginning because you have player injuries. I mean, this is part of the NFL, but it's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate, too. And one of the big discussion points in all of my messages over the last, say, 36, 48 hours is just how furious people were that we had Week 14 buys, and so many of them. Because you do have a lot of formats, too, where it's set up that you have multi-conferences. I mean, you think about the Scott Fish Bowl, obviously, into the playoffs, but you have a lot of individual, really cool dynasty leagues where either you have two conferences so the playoffs start early, or you have a multi-week final so the playoffs start early. Now, obviously, if you're an FFPC main event final, then, it's kind of a trade-off, because in redraft especially, you knew when the buys were. You could choose to kind of get that guy for an extra week in the regular season. Maybe you advanced by 3 points, and having an extra week in the regular season is why you got there in the first place. So you kind of go in knowing that. At the same time, it's still frustrating. When you're looking at the draft and you're on the clock, you shouldn't be saying, I'm going to pass on Jonathan Taylor because he's got a Week 14 bye. You should just be able to make the selection you want. And so those things I think are frustrating as well. Maybe the NFL will clear them up. Maybe the NFL doesn't care. It just doesn't seem like a great spot to have buys anyway. When you talk about teams that have the buys really early versus the teams that have the buys late, there are going to be advantages and disadvantages to both, but it would just make more sense to have the buys in the middle of the season. That being said, I do still think that the last month featured a lot of exciting football. And sadly, injuries are a big part of the fantasy experience. Colm, you and I had enough injuries on our teams this year that, I mean, anybody who lost a key player needing 5 points or 10 points, or, I mean, Kyler Murray and Ramondre Stevenson could have given you 30. I mean, they could have combined for 70. I mean, so there were all of these exciting things that could have happened that didn't. We now do obviously look forward to the playoffs without them as well. I had a lot of exposure to Kyler Murray on teams that are still alive. And Zachary Kruger and I, who did some best ball shows together, you had a great best ball series with Zach. When we've got a team that advanced in the best ball tournament FFPC where our quarterbacks are Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray. So now you're kind of hoping that Lamar maybe plays this next week. So you've got a shot to advance. I mean, we've all had teams put up big scores without a quarterback at all. But when you think about the quality of the opponents you're going to be facing in the fantasy playoffs, but then again, even that has a little bit of an asterisk because you go through and you look, and because of how crazy this year was, where the first 2 rounds, very, very solid, a few landmines, a few injuries, but a lot of points there, and then not a ton of points otherwise. Now, I mean, you could hit on some players, and we're going to go through the winning Underdog $1 million roster. That team hit on a lot of players. That team, very, very good. There are going to be some teams like that in there, but there are also actually quite a few playoff teams where you look at their roster and you're thinking, maybe I could beat that team even without a quarterback. Now, can you beat a whole league full of those teams? That's going to be a little bit of a different question. Didn't happen on Monday Night Football, but the other big injury this week that will impact best ball tournaments, will impact fantasy playoffs. Dameon Pierce out. He was obviously one of the best picks. And depending on how early in the season you got him, if you drafted him in the 5th or 6th round, then, I mean, you could argue that maybe it's even a neutral to maybe a slightly minus pick. Still a good pick. If you got him in the 10th round, if you got him in the 15th round, a huge value for you, a huge impact player, and to not have him for these next couple of weeks is unfortunate because he was really the one cool thing that the Texans had going for them. Obviously, they play a fantastic game, shuttling the quarterbacks in and out against the Dallas Cowboys this last week. But a sad way for the fantasy season to end. That is the way it goes. And now we've got more excitement to look forward to. These next 3 weeks should be awesome.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. You mentioned it's going to be interesting to see the landscape. I do think week 14 in these best ball tournaments is probably going to clear out some of the teams that maybe scraped through with those injuries as the season went along, and we'll see what happens. But that's the unique thing, particularly about this NFL season, but about every week in the NFL, that pretty much anything can happen. And we've seen that happen where you're probably looking at some of these teams and you're like, this team's loaded. And then all of a sudden, a few injuries or plays don't go their way, and those teams sometimes are only putting up 50, 60 points by a whole team rather than potentially having single players putting up that amount of points, as we've seen with somebody this week like an Evan Engram, who we'll touch on a little bit later in the show. But Shawn, the Patriots do get the win. Pierre Strong coming in, having the opportunity with the injury to Stevenson, 70 rushing yards on 5 attempts for him and 1 touchdown. Kevin Harris gets in the end zone, 8 for 26, 1 touchdown for him. Takeways Thornton, Shawn, somebody we liked in the offseason, sneaking back in, gets 5 targets, 4 receptions, only the 28 yards. But you mentioned in your bold predictions for the season.
Well, catch the ball and turn the right direction and go score a touchdown. What's he doing?
He's still working his way back, Shawn. He's working his way back to full health after his injury. You mentioned that he may win somebody a big prize this season. Maybe he could be somebody who, if you've snuck him through in these best ball tournaments, could have that big week. But good to see him getting used anyway, Shawn. We'll stick with that. Nelson Aguilar had 10 targets, 5 receptions, just a 32 yards for him. So outside of that, kind of disappointing nights from a majority of the players in this one based on the fact of the injuries and everything that was going on around that. Moving on, though, Shawn, to a team that really disappointed this week, that was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They're 6-7. They play against the 49ers, who are now 9-4. They blow the doors off the Buccaneers here. They really don't have to try in the second half. At halftime, it's 28-0 in this one. Tom Brady, 55 pass attempts, 253 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. On the other side, Shawn, Brock Purdy, not an explosive day from him by any measure, but 16-21, 185 and 2 from him. If you were saying, at any point of this season that Tom Brady's getting outscored here by Brock Purdy, or in terms of the efficiency of the usage. I don't think anyone is going to believe that is a true story. Sometimes these things that happen are like, if this was a Hollywood script, you would say it's unbelievable that it couldn't actually be made. But the big part of it also gets a rushing touchdown for him to improve that day. Christian McCaffrey, 14 rushing attempts for 119 yards, 1 touchdown for him. Deebo Samuel unfortunately gets injured in this one, has a rushing touchdown along with 21 yards on the ground, also at 43 yards through the air and 4 receptions. Brandon Ayuk gets in the end zone again, 2 for 57 from him. We've seen a couple of receptions from George Kittle, but still not the life that we're hoping for. But then through the air, Christian McCaffrey does it again, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 34 yards and 1 touchdown. One thing's for sure, Shawn, it doesn't look like Brock Purdy being the quarterback here is going to affect Christian McCaffrey's scoring and his usage moving forward here. He looked amazing in this game. There has been weeks where there's been concerns, but I thought he looked really, really good here. On the other side, we did talk about it a few times, and it's kind of a recurring event where Mike Evans doesn't get a lot done. Was unfortunate here. There's a holding penalty, takes away a deep touchdown for him, but 4 for 44 on 9 targets from him, 54 yards and 5 receptions for Chris Godwin, 9 targets. Rachaad White does continue to kind of lead the backfield here. Shawn, what was your key takeaways from here other than the 49ers completely putting a whipping here on the Buccaneers?
Yeah, this was crazy. I mean, you kind of expect that the 49ers are going to win this game despite the matchup between Tom Brady and Mr. Irrelevant. Tom Brady's just playing that poorly, and the San Francisco 49ers defense too strong. Their variety of weapons on offense too deep, too varied, too talented. And yet the exact way that the game played out, I think, pretty shocking, because Purdy looked fantastic. It's not just that he goes 16 for 21, averages almost 9 yards per attempt, throws the 2 touchdowns. And both of these touchdowns, I mean, the guys get open, right? You're talking about Brandon Ayuk running an incredible route where he shakes the defender and ends up open by 15 yards. You have Christian McCaffrey open down the sideline, making a nice catch, spinning as he falls back into the end zone. A little bit of a bobble there. It is great that he caught that. But when you have these weapons, you should be able to do something with it. We were giving the 49ers a lot of trouble a couple of weeks ago because you've got these 4 guys and they're not doing that much with it. As you mentioned, still frustrating to see where Kittle is, although he was used on some key plays to extend drives. The disappointing element here is that Deebo Samuel finally looked more like the 2021 Deebo. He has the rushing touchdown. They're using him in a variety of ways in the receiving game. His lateral explosiveness is leaving people in the dust. He looks powerful, and then he gets hurt. And so, I mean, the San Francisco 49ers have been the most cursed team. I mean, you look at your fantasy teams that are all wiped out, and basically that's the 49ers over the last 3, 4, 5 years. Everybody on their team gets hurt all of the time. Their receivers are all out. I mean, they make the move for McCaffrey in part because they know their running backs are all going to get injured. They're down to their 3rd-string quarterback. But even when you have all of those weapons, to see what Brock Purdy did was extraordinary, because the level of calm, the level of athleticism, I mean, he's making twirling throws, evading tackles, showing patience, getting out on the edge, making the right decision. This was superstar stuff. Now, when you're Mr. Irrelevant, you expect, okay, well, you're going to turn back into a pumpkin at some point. You got a little bit of that Bailey Zappi flavor where, they go to him in that game, bench Mac Jones. He has the quick touchdown. And then as the game develops, finally now, when it's a little bit of a quarterback controversy almost, he struggles to do the same things that he did when Mac Jones was just purely out. But you look at the performance from Purdy here. You look at the performance from Zappi. It again kind of undermines this idea that these NFL teams should be going for the retreads, where you have players like Baker Mayfield, Carson Wentz, who have failed again and again, and to continue to pay them and to give up assets for them. I guess for me personally, it's not the way to play it. I mean, you could have selected Purdy and paired him with a Sam Howell. You can see what these guys can do, given what a couple of these other late round QBs have done, and the contrast. I mean, Sam Howell is basically like a superhero version of Purdy. And Purdy goes to Iowa State. He was someone that they thought was going to be a difference maker for their program. Iowa State's had some guys come through, like an Alan Lazard, obviously David Montgomery. You have Breece Hall. You have some other wide receivers who have busted. But the program there has been sort of under the radar, an interesting college football story over the last 4 or 5 years. Pretty good, but never really develops into the star that they hoped he might be. One of the reasons, obviously, that he ends up going with the very last pick in the draft, which is cool because that makes this an even better story. He looks like he's going to have a long-term future in the league at the very least as a backup. I'm excited to see what's going to happen here. Again, it's a matter of, can you do it for 3 quarters versus can you do it? I mean, lots and lots of quarterbacks who are not good have had a 3-quarter stretch where they were fantastic. And so it's a matter of extending this over the longer term. But right now, it's hard to feel like Jimmy Garoppolo gives the 49ers a significantly better chance to win than Brock Purdy does.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is, like, you mentioned him being Mr. Irrelevant, but he has given himself, in terms of career opportunities, a lot more opportunities down the line, whether it doesn't work out here in San Francisco or whether it does. But teams will continue to take chances based on what he's put on tape over the last couple of weeks. So it's quite exciting. It feels like that Cinderella story, and we'll see how that plays on over the course of the next couple of weeks, because this is a 49ers team now that they have a chance to be making that little bit of a playoff run, even though with the injuries, having Christian McCaffrey there now and having the other weapons they do is going to give opportunities to continue to win games. As we continue to look at the quarterback landscape, Shawn, the next one to mention is Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens. This was one where Kenny Pickett, a bit like what we've seen with Kyler Murray, but this was a contact, it was a sack, and we've seen, these roughing the passer calls where, we're like, that's a little bit soft. He is kind of physically flung to the ground here, does bang his head to the ground, goes into concussion protocol. Mitch Trubisky comes in. Trubisky kind of does Trubisky things, and that leads to the Pittsburgh Steelers not being very good in this game. On the other side, the Baltimore Ravens were not very good, but they do progress to 9-4. And you mentioned Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson started the season very hot, but has struggled at points throughout, and this team has struggled on offense. The big reason to get this W this week is J.K. Dobbins, who was activated this week, is back healthy, and he has 15 carries in this for 120 yards and 1 touchdown. I mentioned this on the recap show briefly when we were talking about it. He has a breakaway run, is 44 yards. I think if he's 100% healthy, he has the breakaway speed and he gets all the way to the end zone. He never looked like he was fully extended to the point where we would have seen him in the past. But, Tyler Huntley has 8 for 12, 88 yards passing in this one. We have Anthony Brown with 5 pass attempts, 3 completions, 16 yards for him. So we get really nothing then in the passing game. Mark Andrews, 6 targets, 2 receptions, 17 yards. Last year, Mark Andrews was the tight end that was surging teams into the playoffs as we moved into that point. The FFPC final that we were in last year, Shawn, was pretty much all Mark Andrews teams barring one team. But we'll see what happens with Lamar this week if he is healthy. But the Baltimore Ravens are struggling in offense at the moment outside of what J.K. Dobbins was able to produce this week. The other quarterback, Shawn, that really struggled to produce, and this was in the early portion of the game, in the first quarter in particular, Russell Wilson looked as bad as he has for the entire season in that first quarter against the Kansas City Chiefs. Throws a pick 6 then I believe that was in the second quarter, which is just a really bad play, leads to being the interception returned for the touchdown by Willie Gay. But we looked through the rest of it, and they never don't think we're going to win this game, but 34-28 it finishes to the KC Chiefs. Russell Wilson picks it up quite dramatically after that point. 23 of 36 for 247 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. That one obviously leading to the touchdown, but he has a rush towards the end of the game, does get hits his head to the ground. Brett Rippon had to come in then for the end of the game. 4 of 8, 16 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception for him. Russell Wilson also had 57 yards rushing. So I think as bad as that first and part of the second quarter was, people were, really ramping into him. And I think he has struggled so bad, and this contract's going to look terrible, I think, moving forward. And with this loss now, that pick that's going to go to the Seahawks is ranked to be the 2nd overall pick in this upcoming draft. So all of that considered, I think Wilson had a much better portion of this game than what we've seen from the season. And maybe that's what we hoped we would see all season long. But that leads to Jerry Jeudy, Shawn, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 73 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He was a massive spike week player this week who hit quite big. I know you mentioned to me on Sunday that you had some games where you were debating whether it was going to be Jeudy or different options. You played Jeudy. I'm sure you're very happy about that. Dulcich, 8 targets, just the 3 receptions on those 8 targets for 42 yards. Would love to see him get more involved in Shawn, the play we knew was going to happen this week was 3 targets for Marlon Mack, 2 receptions. One of those receptions going for a 66-yard touchdown. that is obviously an interesting note. On the other side, though, the talking point, I think, has to be Jerick McKinnon. 6 for 22 on the ground, just the 9 targets, just the 7 receptions, just the 112 yards, just the 2 touchdowns for McKinnon. We have seen him used in certain situations, but not actually receive the targets in the passing game. But he has to be the story coming out of this game with a monstrous performance.
There were a handful of highlight plays in this game. The long touchdown for McKinnon is on another one of these improvised plays by Patrick Mahomes that he does so well, on top of his ability to read the defense, his ability to extend plays, the incredible arm strength. I mean, you're talking about the greatest quarterback of all time making a pitch that ends up more or less winning the game. You say that it didn't seem like the Broncos could have won. The Chiefs did struggle in the second half, and actually Mahomes throws a second half interception that was maybe the worst throw that I've seen him make. I mean, maybe in his entire career. That's just how few bad passes he has had. So many of his interceptions are, tip balls of one kind or another. They're plays where he's actually got the guts to try and carry the team at a key moment, all of those types of things. You see interceptions on a purely bad throw virtually never. He had one of those, and it does give the Broncos a chance. They had the ball down 6 twice in the fourth quarter after trailing 27-0. You would not have expected that. I also want to give credit to Willie Gay on that pick 6. Not a great throw, obviously, by Russell Wilson, but the athleticism to make that interception you're going to see from a linebacker very, very rarely. That was a circus play. You mentioned Marlon Mack. He's someone I haven't really understood the lack of interest or the lack of willingness to play him from teams. And you say you don't understand. You're like, he just obviously is done, right? Because he's been on a variety of teams and teams that needed running back performance at the time this season. I mean, the Houston Texans right now, you have to imagine, would love to have Marlon Mack. He demonstrated the long speed on this play. And people obviously are going to disagree on some of these sort of niche kind of takeaways from a handful of plays in preseason, but he looked, I mean, I don't know if you say back. I mean, this is a 1,000-yard rusher before the Achilles injury who did it as an explosive player. I mean, he's a speed player. He's a run-to-daylight player. But he looked good again in the preseason and then gets cut from a team that desperately needs any kind of talent that they can get. Goes a variety of places. Obviously now the Denver Broncos are in a situation where Latavius Murray and Mike Boone are their backs. That's about as clear a path as you have to some workload. So he's an interesting guy to kind of stash in deep dynasty leagues. Obviously, if waivers are still going in your individual format and you have a spot at the end of your bench, you can probably do worse than to add Marlon Mack there. This was a fun back and forth game, and I have a longer piece on the site about Russell Wilson. Obviously, some huge weaknesses to his game. I broke those down and kind of tried to put them in context. We've got some fantastic tools on the site: the Advanced Player Explorer, the Advanced Team Explorer. So much deep info that is interesting as it relates to him, and then kind of tied that back into Jerry Jeudy and what we should expect from him. Obviously, you're not going to have a ton of games where a player puts up 30-plus points on 9 targets and 67 air yards. But kind of under the radar, Jeudy has been a lot better than people think, and he's been better than Courtland Sutton going back beyond this season. I mean, it's easy to say now. I mean, especially now that we have this season's information, it's pretty clear cut. But especially considering the difference in price, I mean, Jeudy has not worked out. There's no question about that. He's more or less always injured. If he could go through a stretch where he got decent quarterback play and stayed healthy for 15, 20 games in a row, I still think there's a better than even chance that he will establish himself, not among the stars. I mean, we have a group of receivers right now that I think rivals any top 5 or 6 group that have ever played. And he's not going to be in that category, but I think he can establish himself as a true wide receiver 1 and sort of a back end wide receiver 1 in fantasy.
Yeah, I think so. And hopefully, this Broncos team does start to get some of the offense we hope we would see at the start of the season. But we'll see what happens moving forward here, Shawn. You mentioned Mahomes. Mahomes continues to play amazing football, but did have 3 interceptions in this, and you mentioned that one being pretty bad. So just a little bit of a weird game where they're coasting, I think, and then they almost get nipped at the end, as you mentioned. Moving on now to the Jaguars and the Titans, and this was one where the Jaguars go 36-22 to win this one. They're 5-8 now. The Titans, as they want to head towards a playoff run potentially, this was a tough loss for them to have. And I have to say that basically the Jaguars took the kind of game plan that the Philadelphia Eagles used the week before and tossed the ball all over the yard. We have Trevor Lawrence, 368 yards and 42 pass attempts, 3 touchdowns. Evan Engram has 15 targets, 11 receptions, 162 yards and 2 touchdowns, which is incredible. When John Daigle had a tweet that he shared after, which Evan Engram is only the 6th tight end in the Super Bowl era to have 10 catches, 150 yards and 2 touchdowns in a single game. And that has accounted for 31.4% of his fantasy points for the entire season. I believe, Shawn, he may be up to tight end 4. We'll need to double check that after we finish, but I think tight end 4 on the season, which shows how tough tight end has been and how unique it has been this season. Zay Jones, 8 for 57 and 1 from him. And I think Trevor Lawrence has had an interesting season. Starts off kind of some struggles, has a real hit point in the middle where I'm like all aboard the Trevor Lawrence train. Has a couple of games in that shook my confidence in him. But Shawn, entering his 2nd season at this point and where he is and how tough that first season was, I do think Trevor Lawrence is starting to, and maybe, achieve what we thought coming in, that this was, a generational prospect, somebody who had all the upside in the world, and he has looked fantastic. In some games, other games struggled a little bit, but this here was a true glimpse into what he can potentially do. On the other side, Derrick Henry had 17 carries, 121 yards, 1 touchdown. That was all pretty early in the game for him. He also had 5 targets, 3 receptions, and 34 receiving yards. Conquo, tight end, kind of backup tight end to Austin Hooper, continues to have some shine here. 6 targets, 6 receptions, 45 yards, and a touchdown for him. But overall, the Jaguars, another impressive kind of step forward for them in their attempt to go from the troubled franchise they have been to having their quarterback and moving forward here with some of these players really stepping up to make plays. But Shawn, I want to get into the winner's circle now. We're going to have the WinBet segment of today. It is going to be the RotoViz Overtime winner's circle. You can sign up today to receive a special sports offer. Bet $100, win $100. Download the WinBet app now or visit wynnbet.com to start winning. Shawn, we're going to talk about a major winner here in a second, but I want to give you the opportunity to hit on. We did win one of the OT leagues here, but our listeners have had another fantastic season, some of those progressing in the FFPC tournaments. Let us know who they are.
Colm, let's start with the big one, the $125 Best Ball Tournament over there at the FFPC. The 2 teams here that come through, I mean, everybody who participated, obviously, one of our favorites. We enjoy all of these guys and appreciate so much their willingness to draft with us. We have Eric and Griffin coming through, Surfer Boy Pizza up there at the top. Griffin obviously put together the fantastic charity event that we were in where it was the guillotine contest. So we avoided being chopped almost down to the end, lost by a couple of points. When we were so close, we had a lot of fun with that. That was a
fun league.
It was a fun league, and it was a contest to benefit people who are dealing with the flooding in Kentucky. There's also obviously been flooding and other natural disaster types of events, other places. So if you want to contribute to that, please let us know. We can get you in touch with the people and people in the fantasy community, which I think is really cool, who are putting some of their time directly into this intersection between fantasy and charity that directly goes out and then benefits people in the community. So if you want to contribute to that, please let us know. But Eric and Griffin coming through there, Eric and I drafted one of the FBG teams. He was the winner, one of the 2 winners of that contest. That team sadly eviscerated by injuries. We were just sort of commiserating the other day about how amazing that team looks. It has both J.K. Dobbins and Jerry Jeudy in addition to all these other stars. Those guys put up some good points this last week, unfortunately, in a situation where it did not matter. But it was such a fun experience to managed those teams with both Eric and Jonathan. Again, thank you to you guys for participating in that. The 2 Superflex leagues, and this Superflex format is my absolute favorite. I was mentioning to you that mostly things went well last night, even with the unfortunate injuries. Managed to get a Best Ball Mania team through. Your kind of scoreboard watching on all of those, and the one that was the closest for me came down to a 0.7 advance when James Conner finally stopped scoring points. Conner was pulling back and pulling back, so I was able to get that team across. But Blair and I have a team in a Superflex format that it didn't lead all the way, but it led a big chunk late, and it seemed very safe going into the final week. But it was a team that had both Ramondre Stevenson and Kyler Murray, and it did get knocked all the way from 1 to out of the contest. A couple of teams that did not get knocked out of the contest, the Cat Dad and Ryan with the cool no punt intended teams, they win the Overtime 1 league. As you mentioned, we had the good fortune, and it definitely is good fortune, to take down Overtime 2, and Patty comes in second. His team had a rough go in week 14, but held on. And so now he's got a chance to see what he can do in the tournament portion of the contest. We're excited about how all of those participants do. And Colm, we say, if we can't win, we hope that one of those listeners does. But basically, I'm rooting for the listeners above our teams. If we can get people from the RotoViz community to win these titles, that is my favorite thing. So looking at this, a lot of excitement. And speaking of winning contests, Colm, it looks to me like, number one, 0 RB teams had already won big tournaments. And so that was always a little bit of a misconception. But it definitely cannot be said anymore with a team that takes the first running back in round 8, takes down the regular season title and the $1 million. Colm, this is a great story.
This is awesome, and obviously it's always awesome when you get a shout out. And Shawn's not on Twitter. Shawn mentioned that people will say now that 0 RB has won a major tournament. Shawn, still, if you're on those Twitter streets, there's still question marks even as of today in terms of now the goalposts are moved.
Are there a lot of people who at one stroke have won more than $1 million in fantasy?
It's hard to tell, Shawn. The robust community do not want to give that up. But King Cap had something to say about that. He wins $1 million in the race for first place. And Shawn, I have to say, in terms of the content this offseason, you mentioned the race for first quite a bit. So hopefully that was in the listener's mind. They were thinking of the race to first, but one of the OT community in Cap has gone and won that all. He had a substantial lead heading into Monday Night Football, and it was Ramondre Stevenson, the only player left against him. Obviously, he got injured, and that's good in this situation for Cap to go and win, but it was a 44-point gap, so it was unlikely to happen. So he had I'm sure he didn't have his feet up. I'm sure his heart was racing on Monday Night Football, but had some DMs with him.
Joe Mixon has scored for like 55, right? So, and Ramondre Stevenson is quite a bit better than Joe Mixon. You could not feel comfortable with any lead short of, 65 is probably to where you don't have to worry about it. But, and again, you actually don't want to see it happen the way that it happened.
Yeah. But
then you don't have to worry.
Yeah, you don't have to worry. But yeah, he gets the W here, leads the way, gets the $1 million season-long prize for the Underdog tournament. That also means obviously he's advanced to the main tournament. So there's a chance when I talk through this team, people might be thinking, yeah, that team has a shot here at winning another $1 million when it gets to the actual final part of the contest. And, yeah, we'll see how it shakes out.
Colm, would you take $3 million with that?
That would be nice. Yeah, I wouldn't mind that too much. Even if people didn't agree that 0 RB had won some major tournaments, I would still settle for $3 million. But he did a tweet yesterday, Shawn, and then we were communicating shortly after. But he did shout out you in particular, shouted out Peter Overzet as well, shouted out the podcast, and we really do appreciate that. Nice guy getting that communication going, and it's exciting to see how this team goes the rest of the way. But Shawn, this is a team that drafted out of the 110. So for people who may not have seen the team, for people who may not have heard the team, going to have a run through of it here, and I think people will say this team's pretty good. So Devontae Adams at 110, Travis Kelce in the second round, AJ Brown, then we get Waddle, then we get Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, the two quarterbacks, Miles Sanders, who had a good week this week for the Philadelphia Eagles as the first running back drafted, as you mentioned earlier, in the 8th round. Then we get Garrett Wilson in the 9th. The 10th is Kenneth Walker, Rashad White in the 11th. We were talking about Dameon Pierce. He was the selection in the 12th round here. So before the hype truly got risen, I guess, for Pierce. But this was still at a point where there was buzz around Pierce's season as he moved up draft boards at that point. Nico Collins is in there, Khalil Herbert. Evan Engram, who we talked about having a monster week this past week, was his 15th round pick. Chris Evans, Zay Jones in there as well, and Davis Mills at the end of the draft. But that was a weird situation actually with Houston this week. But he has Burrow and Hurts to keep that quarterback seat warm. Shawn, that team is absolutely and utterly loaded, and it's still loaded. Obviously, the Pierce injury will hurt here for a couple of weeks, but pretty stacked heading into the final couple of weeks here for the big run for the second huge prize you could potentially win.
Just unbelievable. I mean, this is one of those dream teams. And again, you win $1 million and you beat the number of teams that are in the contest to do it. You know your team is good. But, I mean, you go your whole life looking for a team like this. Adams, Brown, Waddle, Amon-Ra, and then Garrett Wilson. And Garrett Wilson could be the highest scorer of all of them in the fantasy playoffs. And I'm dreaming a little bit there. But you love to see it. Then that mix of running backs with Sanders, Walker, White. Rashad White, a little bit disappointing again this past Sunday. Didn't see the juice from him. One of the things was kind of cool. Pierre Strong is someone that I had mentioned multiple times I thought could be the third best back in this class. Obviously, he's got a long, long way to go to get anywhere near that point. But when he got on the field last night for the Patriots, and I mean, he's made some various mistakes and obviously has gotten himself into a situation where he's not even really necessarily ahead of Kevin Harris on that team. But when he touched the ball, I mean, he flies. And that's what he did as a small school back in college. That's what he did with the testing at the combine. I think that he has a ton of explosiveness. The other guy who is so similar and we wanted to see those big plays from, Rashad White, he's been more disappointing. You don't see the burst that he demonstrated in college. You don't see maybe the timed athleticism. But again, Pierre Strong, a better athlete than that. So we'll see what those guys do. The Patriots have some other backs in the mix. It's not like Strong is going to necessarily go out there and get a lot of touches. We'll see where Damian Harris is on his comeback. Hopefully Ramondre Stevenson doesn't have to miss that much time. It would be a horrible story if he dominates the year and is one of the best and most fun players in the NFL and can't contribute to these teams. I mean, that's really the heartbreaker too. It's not just that you lost the guy in week 14, but maybe he won't be able to contribute in the big weeks. That's the same question here with Dameon Pierce. Where is he going to be? It sounds like week 15 out. It sounds like week 16, very, very questionable. I'm hoping that this squad is there at the very end and maybe week 17, Pierce comes back, breaks off a couple long runs, scores a couple touchdowns. It would be an amazing story if Pierce in 17 was the guy that got this team over the top. But Colm, when you look at how loaded it is at wide receiver, you look at the massive hits, and Kenneth Walker, obviously someone that we're extremely excited about. That's the other one where you need him to come back now, right? And hopefully he's able to do that. His injury not considered to be significant, but in best ball, you don't have to make the start-sit decision. So you don't have to control it. You can just let happen what happens. But the risk of re-injury, even with the non-serious injuries there, just something that, again, as you mentioned, makes your heart beat a little bit faster every time your guy touches the ball. It's that kind of double-edged sword where if you're going to score fantasy points, you have to touch the ball. When they do have the ball, you almost can't breathe there for those moments. Kenneth Walker, hopefully he breaks off some big plays. Wide receiver, running back, absolutely loaded. And yet the best positions on this team, you got those two quarterbacks in the window, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, absolute stars. And then, I mean, you do have, obviously, the flex position here. And Travis Kelce, someone who could factor into the flex slot. How hilarious would it be if he has Travis Kelce and it's Evan Engram who is putting up the big points over the next 3 weeks? We wouldn't necessarily expect that. As you mentioned, a huge chunk of Ingram's performance does come just in that last week. But as is befitting of a team that won $1 million, this is one of the greatest teams of all time.
Yeah, it's absolutely completely and utterly stacked. Like, it's a two tight end build, and that can, if we were reviewing this at draft time, we might be saying that, Travis Kelce is going to be the player who takes you all the way. But then to have Evan Engram come in with an absolute smash week at a certain point of the season like this is massive. So the team looks great, obviously, at tight end at the moment. But I have to say as well, Shawn, the late wide receivers, when we look at, Garrett Wilson, who was in the 9th round, but Nico Collins has had some weeks, but he's not getting used very much in this team. But Zay Jones in the 17th round has, when we look back and look at some of these potential extreme values, we talked a couple of weeks ago about Jamal Williams at the running back position, but Zay Jones has had some very, very productive weeks for those best ball teams that have drafted him. And to see the players that went around him or went before him, there's just no comparison to what Zay Jones has been able to produce. So a couple of Jacksonville Jaguars in this team who, as I mentioned, are having those surging weeks, and then there's some weeks where it's not hitting exactly as they like, but it's going to be fun to see those guys as we progress here. Hopefully Kenneth Walker will be in, Rashad White, as you mentioned. I still think there's enough here at the running back position, but when you're $1 million up, you can say, well, we'll see what happens. Say la vie at this point. But AJ Brown, Jalen Waddle, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Adams, incredible depth all around the wide receiver position.
Yeah, and you mentioned Zay Jones. He had a little note on him in the article where it's just such a cool story because he's that small school possession receiver, obviously setting reception records. He goes to a dysfunctional Buffalo squad. He sticks in the NFL, just by real grit there, revitalizes the career a little bit with the Raiders, has a little bit of the eyebrow-raising contract with the Jags. And yet, he's got a chance to pay out his contract a lot better than Christian Kirk. Kirk has had a good season as well, but you look at their numbers here, Jones just slightly behind in target share. You have just below 24% for Kirk to 22% for Jones. They're being targeted at similar depths, 8.6 to 8.2. Jones, the better catch rate at 69% to 63. Christian Kirk has been a lot better after the catch, more than 100 yards greater after he hauls that ball in. He's been much better in the touchdown department. Jones has just never been able to score touchdowns. He does score in this game. He's had 3 explosive weeks. And if you could get one more of those across 15 through 17, where his point total is difference making for you out of that spot there at the end of a draft, just an absolute home run pick.
Yeah, so really awesome. Shout out again to Cap for getting this massive W for him. We'll see how he goes throughout the playoffs, but really exciting to hear from one of our listeners to have so much success. And we are wishing the guys who got through in our leagues and any of our listeners who have drafted in various contests or even home leagues, everything like that, any leagues that you win this year. But awesome to see, like, $1 million. Absolutely. I was blown away when I was talking with Cap yesterday just to think, like, how much of an achievement this is for him. So incredible. We'll see how the rest of it goes. Good luck to everyone in all those leagues, all those contests. Hopefully we'll have more stories like this before we wrap up for the 2022 season in terms of the playoff finals across all different formats. So that is going to do it for today's show. A shout out again of the discount code for a 1 month pass. You can save yourself 25% off that 1 month pass with the code RVRadio 2022. It's coming up to the holidays. Get yourself a gift. If you haven't tried it out yet, jump on now. RV Radio 2022, 25% off a 1 month NFL pass at rotoviz.com. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can check him out on rotoviz.com, as well as Stealing Bananas with Ben Gretsch. Until we are back with our third show of the week, have a good one.